I rented the cabin because it was supposed to be quiet, untouched, and isolated enough for me to focus. I came to the Pacific Northwest with my notebooks, my sample jars, my hand lenses, and the hope that a few weeks away from the city would help me gather enough data for my research on mosses. I had always loved the damp air here, the way the trees never looked bare, the way green seemed to crawl over every surface if you left it alone long enough. The cabin was set deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with a long dirt road that wound uphill and ended at a clearing. There was no phone service, no electricity beyond a solar panel, and only a wood stove for heat, perfect for someone who wanted to lose track of days and spend time cataloging the forest floor. The first few days were exactly what I wanted. I walked along the shaded trails with a magnifier, crouched on my knees for hours at a time, brushing damp soil aside, pressing moss between sheets of paper. The cabin was small but steady, smelling of cedar inside, with a single bedroom, a table, and shelves stacked with old books that had been left behind by previous renters. Nights were cool and quiet except for the dripping of rain on the roof, and the mornings were slow, fog curling around the trees until the sun finally burned it away. It was on the third morning that I noticed the boards near the hearth were darker than the rest, almost as though they were wet. At first, I thought it was just moisture seeping up from the ground, but when I knelt to inspect it, I saw fine green threads poking up through the cracks between the planks. Moss. It wasn't unusual for a structure in these woods to be overtaken by growth, but this was the center of the cabin, not an outside wall. The boards were tight, but when I pressed one corner with my knife, I could see the green mass beneath. It looked denser, richer than anything I'd seen outside. I pried up one of the boards the next day to get a better look. Beneath it was a thick mat, dark and spongy, packed tight enough that when I touched it, it almost seemed to pulse. The smell was sharp, earthy, heavier than normal moss. I cut a small sample, slid it into a jar, and set it on my desk with the others. That night, as I sat reading, I kept glancing at the jar. I couldn't tell why, but it felt different. Not just a sample, something alive in a way I couldn't explain. The next morning, the sample had spread inside the jar, not just pressing against the glass like other moss did, but branching, forming delicate threads that pressed up like fingers trying to reach light. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something faint, a kind of whisper, not outside, not inside, but close, right beneath my skin. I told myself it was exhaustion. By the end of the week, the moss under the floorboards had crept further. I noticed damp streaks climbing up the wooden supports of the bed, a soft fuzz forming at the edges of the dresser drawers. When I woke one morning, I found a small patch on my pillow, dampening the fabric, as though it had bloomed during the night. I cleaned it away, burned the fabric in the stove, but it came back again the following night. The longer I stayed, the more I realized the moss reacted to me. If I sat still, breathing slow, it seemed to recede, holding its place. But if my heart pounded, if I felt anxious, it grew faster, stretching in thin webs across the floor. When I had a nightmare one night and woke sweating, I found strands curling up the bedpost, reaching toward me. My breathing slowed only when I pulled the sheets tight around me and lay frozen, waiting for morning light. Then it started on my skin. At first, it was only a small irritation on my arm. A rash I thought was from the damp air or maybe from brushing against too much lichen outside. But the redness didn't fade. Thickened, darkened, until I could see green in the cracks. I scraped at it with my knife and a wet smell rose, sharp and fungal. A smear of green spread beneath my fingernails. By the next day, the same thing appeared at the edge of my collarbone, then down my thigh. The whispers grew louder the more I touched it. At first, just faint rustles like leaves in wind, then more distinct, forming shapes, patterns, as though meaning lived in the sound but wasn't meant for language. I didn't know how, but I understood. It wanted to go further than the floorboards. It wanted out. I tried to fight it. I left the cabin for a whole day, wandering miles into the forest, keeping my skin away from the damp, trying to dry myself out. I ate little, hoping starvation would slow whatever was happening. But when I returned that evening, the growth inside the cabin was worse than ever. The walls were streaked green, the chairs damp, the ceiling hanging with fine moss threads. My notebooks were ruined, the pages soaked with creeping tendrils that blurred my writing into stains. I tried to burn it. I set fire to the hearth, fed it with pages, with bits of broken furniture, even poured alcohol from my sample jars to spread the flames. The fire roared, smoke filled the cabin, and for a moment, I thought it was working. But when the smoke cleared, the moss remained blackened but alive, curling back, unfurling, stretching further. It only spread faster after that. My skin was no better. Within days, the patches had thickened into mats, rough to the touch, softening when wet. My arms itched constantly, and when I scratched, I pulled away filaments like damp hair, green and glistening. The whispers never stopped. They filled my ears when I tried to sleep. They pressed into my thoughts when I wrote. I realized then what it wanted, to leave these woods, to travel with me. My body was just a vessel, something soft enough to carry it. By the second week, my bed was nothing but a wet mat, the sheets unrecognizable, the wood soft and damp with growth. I woke with moss on my lips, pressed into my mouth as though it had grown there overnight. I hacked it out with my fingers, spat green, and sat shaking until morning. The solar panel failed sometime in those days. I lost track of time. Nights and days blurred into the same dim gray. I thought about leaving, about hiking down the long road, back to town, finding someone, begging for help. But every time I packed a bag, the whispers sharpened, filling me with dread, reminding me that if I carried it back, it would spread fast, beyond the trees, beyond the hills. It wasn't just me it wanted everywhere. And the more I thought of stepping outside, the more the growth thickened in my throat, closing it off, forcing me to stay. Now my arms are almost covered. My legs too. The skin beneath is softer, weaker, bloodless in places. The moss grows inside the cracks of my nails, in the corners of my eyes. I feel it in my lungs when I breathe, each inhale pulling damp spores deeper. I haven't looked at my reflection in days, but I can feel it, the slow reclaiming, the way flesh gives way to green. I sit at the table now, writing this with what strength I have left, because I know I won't last much longer as myself. The whispers are almost words now, clear enough that I don't need to fight them. It doesn't hurt anymore. The fear has dulled. What it wants is simple, to be carried, to be spread. To use me as its shell until there's nothing left of me but something soft enough to walk into the world. And I know it will succeed if I leave this place. If I step outside, it will travel further than I ever could on my own. So I stay. I let the wood stove die cold. I let the rain creep in. The cabin is sealed now, damp with green, breathing with me. The forest will take me soon, and with me the moss will stay, bound to these trees, to this soil, to the cabin it grew beneath. It will not leave if I don't, and I won't. I've been driving long haul for over 20 years, covering highways and back roads from coast to coast. I know every kind of weather, every rest stop, every diner where the coffee tastes like burnt rubber and the pie is just sweet enough to keep you going. But there's one thing I've never been able to explain, no matter how many miles I put behind me. It's a cabin, small, old, and falling apart, always parked in the same spot along Route 49. No matter where Route 49 runs, no matter the state, I see it. Always there, just off the shoulder, stuck in the weeds like it's waiting for someone to notice it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the long hours on the road were messing with my head. But I swear, it's the same cabin every time. The wood is gray and rotting, with the paint peeling off in long strips like old skin. The windows are broken, some boarded up, others cracked and stained with years of dirt. A sagging porch leans to one side, the steps missing or broken. And somehow, no matter where I see it, the trees around it are always the same kind. Tall pines that seem to block out the sunlight, casting long shadows even at midday. I never stopped. I never wanted to get close. The cabin felt wrong. Like it didn't belong in the world I know, like it was a glitch in the map or a bad memory frozen in time. But then, last week, everything changed. I was driving through a storm, the rain coming down so hard it blurred the lines on the road. Thunder rumbled low and steady, and the wind whipped my rig from side to side. I was tired, my eyes stinging from the spray on my windshield. Then, suddenly a deer, or maybe a dog, jumped out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, my rig fishtailing on the wet asphalt. I swerved hard to the right, tires skidding off the road, and my truck came to a rough stop in a patch of dirt and grass. When I looked up, there it was, the cabin, right in front of me, closer than ever before. I had no choice but to get out. The storm was getting worse, and the cab of my truck was no shelter against the wind and rain. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, then crossed the muddy ground toward the cabin. There was no road behind me, just thick woods and a drop-off that probably led to some river or creek. No cell signal, no way to call for help. I was trapped. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something else I couldn't place, like mold mixed with decay. Inside, the cabin was small but cluttered. A few broken chairs leaned against the walls, a rusted stove stood in the corner, and a table covered in dust sat near the window. But what caught my eye was the wall across from the door. It was covered with dozens of driver's licenses, nailed up like trophies. I walked closer, flashlight beam shaking in my hand. Each license was faded and yellowed with age, but I could still make out the names and photos. Men and women, some looking young, others older. Some licenses were cracked or torn, others still mostly intact. The dates on them went back decades, 70 years, maybe more. Each one belonged to a trucker who had vanished on this stretch of highway, never found or heard from again. I recognized a few names from old news stories I'd heard over the years. The place felt colder than the storm outside, though the wood stove wasn't lit. I checked the windows. The glass was thick but grimy, and the shadows outside looked darker than they should. I heard the sound then, a low, soft scraping, like something circling the cabin. I looked out but saw nothing except the trees swaying in the wind. No animals, no cars, just the sound, moving slowly around the cabin's perimeter. I wanted to leave, but the rain was coming down in sheets, and the dirt around the cabin was turning to slick mud. I decided to stay the night, hoping the storm would pass by morning. I found an old cot in the corner, covered it with the jacket I had, and settled down. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the scraping sound got closer, like footsteps or claws dragging through leaves. I kept hearing my name whispered, soft and rough, barely louder than the wind. The whispers didn't sound like anyone I knew. They were hollow, like the wind inside an empty barrel. They said my name over and over, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was a warning. I didn't want to fall asleep, but exhaustion won in the end. When I woke up, the storm was gone, but the cabin felt heavier. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I grabbed my flashlight and went back to the wall of licenses. Then I noticed something new. One license was missing. Not mine, but one I remembered from a story about a guy who disappeared in the 70s. The one that made me uneasy the moment I saw it. Then I heard the sound again, outside the cabin. It wasn't scraping this time, but a slow, steady circling. Something was walking around the cabin, but it never knocked or tried to get in. It just waited, like it wanted me to see it or maybe to stay. I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket, opened the door, and looked around. The trees were too thick, the ground muddy and uneven. No roads, no paths, just the same endless forest stretching out in every direction. I started walking, not sure where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay. The sun was rising now, pale and weak through the branches. The whispers followed me, fading but never completely gone. My heart pounded as I pushed through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks. After what felt like hours, I found a dirt road, narrow and overgrown but definitely a road. I followed it until I finally got a signal on my phone, called in my location and asked for help. The rescue team found me hours later, tired, muddy, and shaken, but alive. Afterward, I reported everything to the highway patrol, but they had no record of any cabin there. No missing truckers linked to that spot. Nothing. It was like the place didn't exist outside that stretch of road where I first saw it. I still drive Route 49, but I don't see the cabin anymore. Maybe it was just a trap, a loop, something tied to the lonely highways and the stories truckers tell to keep themselves awake. Maybe it's a place that exists between places, where time and roads fold back on themselves. But I know one thing. If you ever see a rundown cabin just off the shoulder on Route 49, don't stop. Don't get out. Keep driving, even if it means running into a storm or swerving off the road. Because if you don't, you might end up like the licenses on that wall. Another name lost in the endless loop of that cabin, waiting for someone else to find it, waiting for the next trucker to fall asleep and hear their name whispered in the dark. The cold hit me the moment I stepped out of the truck, sharper than anything I'd felt before, like the air itself was full of tiny knives. The Alaskan wilderness stretched out in every direction. Dense, dark, endless forest with thick trunks that clawed at the sky and shadows that seemed to breathe. Our group had driven hours off the beaten path to reach the hunter's cabin, a tiny wooden box lost in the trees. The place was abandoned, they said, untouched for decades. The plan was simple. Spend a few days out here, get away from the noise of the city, maybe catch some quiet. But something about this place didn't feel right. We pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The cabin was small, maybe no bigger than a large shed. The wood was aged and gray, the floorboards warped and uneven. There was an old stove in the corner, and a couple of rickety chairs pushed up against a table covered in dust and dried stains. On the wall, there were nails hammered into the wood, probably where someone once hung their hunting gear. I felt a weight in the air, like the cabin was holding its breath. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses into your ears. On the table, I noticed a small stack of journals bound in cracked leather. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was clear. I flipped one open and started reading. The entries were from the 1960s, written by the hunter who once lived here. His words were straightforward but full of growing fear. He wrote about something living in the woods, something small and fast. He described it as a creature that chewed through bones like sugar cane, sharp teeth breaking down even the hardest parts with ease. It wasn't a bear or a wolf, but something smaller, maybe a giant rodent or a pack of them. He warned that it was clever, able to hide in tight places, even inside the walls of the cabin itself. We shrugged off the notes as an old man's paranoia at first. It was Alaska, you expected wildlife, right? But that night, as the wind howled outside, I heard something scratching inside the walls. A tiny, sharp sound, like nails on wood but faster, more frantic. I froze. Everyone else was pretending not to notice. In the morning, we found our food stash ruined. Packs of dried meat had been shredded, cans dented and gnawed at the edges. Our gear wasn't spared either. Backpacks had holes chewed into the fabric, rope frayed to strings. One of my friends noticed bite marks on his boots, deep enough to draw blood. The pattern wasn't from any animal we knew. The teeth marks were too small for a bear or a wolf, but too precise to be from a mouse. It was as if something was intentionally going after our supplies, stripping us down slowly. We tried to stay calm, convincing ourselves it was just some raccoon or porcupine, but the damage kept happening. Every morning, food was missing, gear shredded further, and the feeling of being watched grew heavier. The scratches in the walls became louder at night. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of something darting just beyond the window, a blur of movement so fast it disappeared before I could get a good look. Then people started vanishing. The first was Mark. He went out early one morning to check traps we'd set up around the cabin. We waited for hours, calling his name, but there was no answer. Outside, there were faint tracks leading into the dense trees, but no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing to explain where he went. We searched for days but found nothing. It was like he'd been swallowed by the forest. After that, panic set in. We barricaded the doors, stacked chairs against the windows. We tried to keep the fire going constantly, the flames crackling with life, but even that didn't stop the scratches from coming. At night, the sound was unbearable. Tiny claws scraping, tiny teeth gnawing, right behind the walls, right under our feet. I could feel eyes watching from the darkness, waiting for a chance. It wasn't long before Sarah disappeared too. She was sitting by the stove one evening, writing in her journal. I looked away for just a moment, and when I glanced back, she was gone. No noise, no fight, just empty space where she'd been. The only sign was her backpack, torn apart on the floor, and a trail of tiny footprints crawling along the windowsill and into a gap in the wall. We realized then that the creature wasn't just outside. It was inside with us. It lived in the walls, in the floorboards, in every crack and crevice of the cabin. It was small enough to slip through the tiniest holes, but smart enough to pick us off one by one. It didn't need to be big to be deadly. Its teeth could shred bone. The speed was unmatched. It was a hunter, and we were the prey. The cabin, once a place of refuge, turned into a cage. We tried to block every hole, every vent, stuffing clothes and sticks into the cracks. But the creature was relentless. It found new ways in, gnawing through wood, squeezing through gaps we didn't even know existed. The more we tried to fight it, the more it tore us down. When it was my turn, I was exhausted and terrified. I knew I couldn't outrun something that could slip through the smallest spaces, something that lived inside the walls and waited patiently. I spent hours listening, waiting for the telltale scratches that meant it was close. I was too scared to move, too scared to sleep. On the last night, I hid inside a makeshift fort of crates and blankets in the center of the cabin. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might give me away. The scratching started again, slow at first, then frantic, coming from all around me. I could feel it, the weight of its tiny body pressing against the wood, testing for weak spots. I remembered the journals. The hunter had tried to trap it once, using poison and bait. It didn't work. The creature outsmarted him every time. I looked around and saw an old metal trap in the corner, rusty but still usable. I set it near the biggest hole I could find, baiting it with the last scraps of meat we had. The trap snapped in the night, I heard it before I saw it, the sharp, frantic squeal of the animal caught. I shone my flashlight and saw a small, rat-like creature thrashing violently. Its fur was matted, its eyes wild with fear and fury. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a large rat or a small fox, but those teeth were terrifying. Yellowed and sharp, perfect for crushing bone. I knew I had to finish it before it could escape and get someone else. I grabbed a heavy stick and struck it until it stopped moving. The silence that followed was unbearable, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When dawn came, I packed what I could carry and left the cabin behind. I took the journals with me as proof of what had happened here. The others were gone, and I was lucky to be alive. The Alaskan wilderness didn't just have big, scary animals. It had something smaller, something cunning that lived in the shadows, in the walls, and could tear you apart before you even saw it coming. I'll never forget that cabin. The sound of those teeth gnawing just inches from my skin, or the feeling of being hunted in a place where no one could hear your screams. It was real. It was terrifying. And it's out there still, somewhere in the woods, waiting for the next group of people foolish enough to come looking. The letter showed up on the morning of my 40th birthday. No return address, just my name in neat block letters on the envelope. Inside was a folded paper with a string of GPS coordinates, a small brass key taped next to it, and nothing else. No note, no explanation. I should have thrown it away. I'd been drinking more than usual after the divorce, trying to get through the days without having to think too much. My ex took the house. I was in a one-bedroom apartment I didn't care about. I'd taken time off work because I couldn't concentrate. The silence in my life was growing louder. So I saw that letter as something different, something strange, maybe even something interesting. I looked up the coordinates. The location was deep in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, up in the Adirondacks. No roads nearby, just forest. It would take a few hours to drive and probably a hike after that. I don't know what I expected. I just knew I didn't want to sit alone in my apartment all day staring at the walls, or worse, thinking about how I used to spend my birthdays before everything went wrong. I picked a bag. Some water, a flashlight, my knife, a jacket, and the key. I drove 6 hours straight, then parked near an old trail that matched the direction of the coordinates. It was late afternoon by then. The trail was barely visible, more like a suggestion of a path than a real one. I hiked for about an hour before I saw it. A cabin, new but not flashy, wood panels, green metal roof, no signs of wear. It looked like someone had just finished building it yesterday. There was a small porch, clean steps, and a doormat. I stood there for a long time just staring. The key fit the lock perfectly. Inside, everything was spotless. A fully stocked kitchen, fireplace ready to light, neatly made bed with folded sheets. The fridge had all the foods I grew up eating, brands I hadn't touched in decades. A 6-pack of root beer I thought they stopped making. Canned ravioli, American cheese, snack cakes my mom used to sneak into my lunchbox. Every label was familiar. I opened the cabinets. Same thing. It wasn't just stocked. It was me. In the living room, I saw framed photos on the walls and shelves. Not landscape shots or random decor. They were pictures of me, as a kid, in the backyard with my first bike, blowing out candles on a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cake. Me in high school with a black eye after a fight I barely remembered. These weren't digital prints. They looked like originals. I touched one of the photos. My hand was shaking. I couldn't remember who took most of these pictures. Some of them I was alone. Others I had no memory of at all. In the corner was an old CRT television and a VHS player. Next to it, a small shelf with a dozen black tapes, each labeled in white marker. They had dates on them, all matching moments in my life. December 24th, 1990. June 3rd, 1998. October 11th, 2009. One tape, sitting by itself on top of the player, was labeled Tonight. I didn't put it in right away. I just sat there for a long time, thinking, wondering who could have done this, how they got those photos, why they had tapes of my life. I thought maybe it was a prank, but who would go this far? And why? Eventually, I picked up the Tonight tape and slid it into the player. The screen went black for a few seconds, then static, then a view of the cabin. This cabin, same angle as if someone had set up a camera on a tripod 100 feet away, just beyond the tree line. In the footage, the lights were on. The front door was closed. Snow was falling lightly, and someone was standing in the clearing. I leaned in closer. The shape of the body, the way they stood. It was me. Same jacket, same jeans, same face, same everything. I paused the tape. I walked to the window. Nothing but dark trees and the sound of wind in the leaves. I played the tape again. The figure outside didn't move, just stood there, watching the cabin. The timestamp on the bottom of the screen ticked forward in real time. I checked the clock on the wall. The time on the tape was matching the time right now. I hit stop, turned off the TV, sat down on the couch. I didn't know what I was feeling. Numb, mostly. Maybe panic, but dull. I kept thinking it had to be some kind of trick. I locked the door, turned off all the lights except one lamp. I wanted to leave, but the dark outside suddenly felt heavier, too quiet. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch, still dressed, the knife under the pillow. I woke up just after 3 a.m. The TV was on. The tape was still playing. The figure was closer, halfway to the porch. I got up slowly, moved to the window, pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. I turned off the TV. I didn't sleep again. I just sat in the chair by the window until sunrise. When daylight came, I opened the door. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been near the cabin. But the tape had changed. Played it again. The figure walked up to the porch, then stood still, looking directly into the camera. Into me. Then the screen went black, and the tape ejected on its own. I left the cabin within 10 minutes. When I got back to my car, I checked my backpack. Everything was where I left it, except the VHS tape labeled Tonight. It was gone. In its place was a new envelope. Inside was another set of GPS coordinates, and another key. That was a year ago. Since then, I've gotten 3 more envelopes, each one with coordinates, each one with a key. The cabins are always different, but the pattern is the same. Photos, food, tapes, all from my life. But it's not just memories anymore. Some of the tapes show things that never happened to me, but they could have. One showed me getting married to someone I don't know. Another showed me working a job I never had, in a city I've never lived in. In every one, I'm older, different, like versions of me from another place. Sometimes the figure shows up again, still wearing my face. But the more I watch the tapes, the less I feel sure it's not me. What scares me isn't the cabins anymore. It's that whoever or whatever is doing this knows me better than I do, knows who I was, who I could have been, and maybe who I'm going to be. The last tape didn't have a label. When I played it, it was just a mirror. Me sitting in the chair, watching, and behind me, someone stepping out from the shadows. Not with my face, with a better version of it. Cleaner, healthier, sharper eyes. Like someone had taken the raw material of my life and made a better copy. And in that moment, I realized something I still haven't told anyone. They're not stealing my identity. They're replacing it, one piece at a time. The cabin was set deep in the woods, perched on a slope above a lake so clear it almost looked like glass. The water barely moved during the day, and the trees on the opposite shore sat still as paintings. My wife and I had come here on a marriage retreat. No phones, no internet, just the two of us and whatever we could face together. We'd been having problems for a while, nothing too dramatic, just that slow, silent kind of distance that grows when you're not paying attention. This place was supposed to help us get back to something solid. It was a small cabin, one bedroom, a kitchen that opened into the living area, and a bathroom tucked behind a thin door. Everything was made of wood, even the floors and the low-beamed ceiling. There was a fireplace that gave off that heavy pine smell, and the windows all faced the lake except the back wall, which was just flat, unbroken wood. That's how I remembered it, at least. The first few days were peaceful. We hiked, made simple meals, read old books that previous guests had left behind. I chopped some firewood even though it wasn't that cold, just to feel like I was doing something with my hands. The nights were the best part. We'd sit quietly and watch the lake reflect the moonlight, sometimes falling asleep to the sound of wind in the trees. It was the fourth night when something changed. My wife had gotten up to get a glass of water, and I heard her stop halfway across the room. The silence stretched long. I turned in bed, not really worried, more curious than anything, and saw her standing still in the hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom. She didn't say anything, but I could see she was looking at the back wall. I got up, walked to where she was, and followed her eyes. There was a window. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. We had walked through this cabin a dozen times since we arrived, and the back wall had always been solid. But now, somehow, there was a square window about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, set in the center of the wall. The glass was thick and dusty, but you could see through it clearly. On the other side was another cabin. It was identical. Same layout, same wood paneling, same furniture, even the same books stacked on the coffee table. But the lighting was off. Everything looked gray, like it was under some kind of filter. The air inside looked thick, like it was underwater. And there were people inside. No, not people. Not exactly. They had our shape. A man and a woman. But their movements were all wrong. Twitchy, jerky, like stop-motion puppets or bad animation. The way their limbs moved didn't look possible. Their necks bent too far. Their fingers curled backward. We stared for a long time. Neither of us spoke. I don't even remember breathing. The man figure walked past their version of the fireplace, and the woman figure tilted her head too far, like she was listening. I thought they might be looking at us, but I couldn't be sure. Eventually, we just went back to bed. Not because we weren't scared, we were, but because nothing really happened. The window didn't open. They didn't come out. The figures just twitched and moved and faded out when the sun came up. When we woke up the next morning, the window was gone. Just smooth wood again. We checked it over and over. Nothing. I even tapped it with my knuckles to see if it sounded hollow. Solid. No sign that anything had ever been there. That day passed slow. Neither of us said much. We both felt it, like something was sitting just behind the walls. Something waiting. The next night, it came back. Same place. Same size. But now, the figures inside looked more like us. They were wearing the same clothes we'd worn the day before. The man's face was shaped like mine, and the woman's hair was the same length and color as my wife's. They moved the same, those awful twitches like broken toys, but they had our posture, our height, even the way we stood. We sat on the couch and watched them. I kept telling myself it was a trick, maybe some strange art installation, or a hidden screen. But the light didn't come from behind the glass. It came from inside, like a dim, natural glow. The woman figure turned her head and looked straight at the window, at us. Her neck turned so far I could hear it in my head, like with splintering. The man figure followed, slow and clumsy, his arms hanging wrong at his sides. I wanted to leave right then, but it felt like moving would break something open. We slept in the same bed that night but barely closed our eyes. Every creak in the wood, every snap of wind outside felt like it might be them, stepping into our world. The next morning, the window was gone again. We packed our bags, planned to drive back into town, even though we still had 3 nights left. But when we got into the car, it wouldn't start. The battery was fine. There was gas. It just wouldn't turn over. No signal on either of our phones, which we turned on out of desperation. We spent the day trying to keep busy. I chopped more firewood. She reorganized the kitchen shelves. But the air felt heavy, like the trees were leaning in closer. I kept checking the back wall, even in the daylight. Nothing, just wood. That night, the window was bigger, 6 feet wide now, took up nearly the whole wall. Inside, the cabin was darker, more warped. The walls curved slightly, as if the whole place was bending inward. The figures were standing directly in front of the window, still, not moving at all. They looked exactly like us. Same faces, same expressions. Even the way my wife stood, 1 foot slightly forward, arms crossed. They were perfect copies, except they didn't blink. They just watched. I thought about covering the window, hanging a blanket over it, or dragging the bookshelf in front of it. But something told me not to, like doing that would provoke them or invite them in. So we watched them for hours, and sometime around 3 a.m., something shifted. The figures started moving, slowly this time, more human. The woman raised a hand, palm open. My wife did the same without even realizing it. It was like the window was pulling her forward. I had to grab her arm to keep her from getting too close. The man inside mimicked me, the way I stood, the way I moved. Every time I shifted my weight, he did too half a second later. Then they smiled. Not wide, just enough to make my stomach turn, like they were happy with what they saw. We didn't sleep that night. In the morning, the window was still there. It had never stayed during the day. The light was different on the other side now, brighter, but flat, like a badly lit stage. We sat in the car until sunset, tried the engine again. Nothing. We thought about walking to the ranger station 6 miles down the trail, but by the time we made the decision, the sun was dropping fast. We didn't want to be in the woods after dark. That night, the window was a full wall. The entire back of the cabin was open to that other place. No glass, just a frame of wood, like a giant painting hanging in the room. They stepped through, but they didn't come out. They stepped forward inside their cabin, like they were crossing an invisible line, like our cabin and theirs were lined up perfectly, and they were getting closer to the edge. We didn't move, just watched, and then sometime near dawn they stopped, right at the edge, 1 step from crossing into our space. Then the light changed, the sun rose, and they disappeared. We left that morning, walked the trail, 6 miles straight, barely stopping. Found a ranger who looked at us like we were crazy when we asked about the cabin. Said nobody had rented it in over a year. Said the road in had been blocked by a rockslide 3 weeks ago. We didn't go back. We never even filed a report. We don't talk about it much now. But sometimes late at night, when the lights are off and the house is quiet, I still check the back wall, just to make sure it's still solid, just to make sure that window never found a way to follow us home.